Well, I think the Australian dream is part of Australia's narrative. Australia is a great myth makers. We make myths and we live in myths. We never really face reality. But let's boil it down into what most people would see as being part of the Australian dream. And the first would be a good job, where your wages go up, it's secure, it enables you to have the income for the other bits of your life. And the second bit would be a good house. There is no religion in Australia other than property. And, the idea of a secure, large house, and that's changed a little bit over the years, but basically it's there. And the third element, which is probably a more recent invention, is essentially the idea that you'll retire when you're not incapable of doing something. So you'll be able to retire, say, at a certain age, whether it's 55, 60, or 65, and you will have a 20-year period of your life when you can almost harvest the fruits of your lives. And part of all of that is the fourth element, which is that you will leave behind wealth and a better future for your progeny. That's basically the four things. And most people don't think in financial terms, but they think in terms of sort of concrete things. And that's a very logical thing to do. So I think they would look at those four things. So let's work our way through each of those. The first is the job market has changed dramatically. And Australia is actually very vulnerable. And let me explain why it's vulnerable. We don't have a manufacturing industry. Okay, and manufacturing is a strange sort of process where if you're a machinist or something like that, you have a long-term stream and generally your skills tend to go for a long period of time. So we live in a kind of a strange world where our major industry doesn't employ very many people. It's just mining and resources. It's very capital intensive. It's not very labor intensive. So we live in a service industry. But the second element of that is we have very high wage structures and the actual employment markets are fairly rigid. Under those circumstances, then the question is, what kind of services can we do? And if you look at the services that pay well, historically they've been professional services, and some of those will continue to do well, some of them will not, but a lot of them will be outsourced. Now, what most people forget and don't really grasp is when we saw manufacturing jobs and other jobs go overseas, the middle-class professionals like the doctors, engineers, the accountants, and the lawyers didn't really mind that too much because it didn't affect them. And the other thing was it brought down the cost of a lot of services, which they liked, gave them more purchasing power. And it was like the great case, well, it's happening to them, it's not happening to us. And in Australia, there was always some resentment of union power and so forth. So it didn't really matter terribly much. But the next wave is actually going to affect those professionals. Because I can now get a contract, a legal contract done in Malaysia for roughly 1/3 the cost. If I'm a draftsman, I'm not going to get my diagrams done here. I'm going to actually get them done in Nepal, where the cost is 1/20th of what it is. Even doctors, you can actually read histology slides anywhere in the world, given communication skills that we have. So basically, all of those jobs will go overseas. Or the other thing is we keep them on shore, and to do that, basically what will happen is you've got to reduce the cost of those services to make them comparable, which means your income is going to drop. So you really have no choice. And that's going to happen in almost every profession you can think of. I can't think of too many professions that's not going to happen. It's a question of the degree. In some cases, you can't basically export the job quite as easily. But the next thing is, it actually has a knock-on effect because income comes down. Then services which you can't export, like you can't really export builders, you can't export plumbers and so forth, but the income to pay for them isn't there in the economy. So basically, we're going to get a change in the income levels in the workforce, which is fairly major. The second element of that, which is also very important, is the way that'll be managed is the idea of lifetime or even long-term employment. When I went into the workforce, which was in 1977, most people would have had more than one employer in their lifetime, but it would be like 2 or 3. It wouldn't be like 20 or 30. Today, 2 or 3 years is a very long time in a job, and that's going to get shorter. So most people are going to become contractors. One of the reasons the employment figures in Australia look quite good is I'm a contractor. So if nobody wants me, I don't have work, but I don't show up in the unemployment statistics. And my income can fluctuate wildly from year to year, but that's not going to show up anyway. So everybody's going to have to adjust to a life of completely different employment and lower income. So the idea of a secure job is now much more fragile than it's ever been. Doesn't mean people won't have work. It'll be different. People will be doing different things. But the income certainty, the security, and the prospects are completely different to what they were. Harley Shaken's an economist in, I think it's Berkeley in the US. And he has this famous phrase, which I've always liked, which is what rolled off the Detroit assembly lines in the United States in the post-war period was not cars. It was the entire American middle class. And that's changed. So that's not going to happen. And there's no guarantee by getting better education, getting your children to be lawyers, etc., is not going to make that much difference to that sort of change. It's a fundamental process. What people forget about globalization is actually, I've always said globalization was about equalization. Equalization of wages, equalization of everything else. But the problem is everybody assumed everything would go up. And it's like water. It finds its level, but it's the average level. It doesn't go up necessarily, and that's the problem. The second thing is, if you don't have the income, the idea of buying houses and having secure housing is fundamentally undermined. Because you're going to have the income, but not only do you have to have the income, you have to have the stability of the income and the fact that you have a job which pays a steady amount of income, which is perhaps rising over a long period of time before anybody's going to lend to you. If you go and say, well, what do you do? Well, I do a bit of this, and I do a bit of this, and I do a bit of this, and I can show you my tax returns for the last 3 years, but is there any guarantee that I can produce that income for the next 20 or 30 years, which is what I need to do to service a mortgage, is much, much more difficult. And the other element is many of the policies post-2009 have actually made housing more expensive. Because if you drop interest rates, effectively, it doesn't work. Because what actually happens is you can borrow more, so you buy houses for more, the price goes up, and housing affordability everywhere around the world has fallen. Home ownership rates have fallen at a rate which is unprecedented in the post-war era. And that's not only in Australia, it's in all around the world. So you're not going to have a house, which has a lot of impacts. One, it's the primary form of saving for most people. And you're not going to be able to create that. And increasingly, that is also the saving for your retirement. And that's not going to actually be possible for people, which leads to the last problem. If you don't have stable income, you can't save. If you don't have wealth creation primarily through residences, then your chances of being able to retire at the time of your own choosing is becoming more and more fragile. I'll give you an example of how vulnerable that all is. Australia has, by most measures, one of the better retirement savings schemes in the world. Now, if you're 25 now, and you're going to work for 40 years and live 20 years after that, as at retirement, you're going to need roughly about, in today's money, $750,000. And that should provide you with $50,000 per annum, which, according to the superannuation industry, is what you need for a couple, provided you don't have to pay for your accommodation. So let's assume you own your own home. That means you have to save around about 15% of your income every year. Now, there's not many people who do that consistently, despite the superannuation levy. But what is the real killer is that you have to earn inflation plus 3 to 5%. And in nominal terms, unless you can earn 5 to 6% on your superannuation saving for 40 years, you're not going to get close to that. But here's the rub. Today, the average person, when they retire, their lump sum is worth $200,000 if you're a man. If you're a woman, it's only $110,000. So assuming both of you pool that, it's $300,000, you're still less than 40% of what you actually need. And that's after they've lived through a boom period where returns have been good and they haven't had the problems of regular income, they've got their own houses. So what I'm just pointing out is the fragility of being able to generate enough money down the track to be able to actually retire. And my view is that retirement before the Second World War was a luxury item. Not many people retired. Most people either became unable to work when they relied on the goodwill of their family or their savings or charitable or the state, depending on where you were, to survive. Or you died. You just literally died on the job. And we're now going backwards towards that whole process. And people don't actually understand that. And if you don't have enough savings, you relied on the pension. Now, there's no way the state can afford to pay that pension at the levels that people need to live the kind of life they've aspired to. And so under those circumstances, what's going to actually happen is the governments are doing a fine job of lowering their bills. So basically what they're going to do is what we've seen, is they're going to push out the retirement age. 65 is going to be 70, 70 is going to become 75, 75 is going to become 80. And so basically, simply because it's a way for them to actually eliminate the actual payments that they're going to have to make. And the second thing then they'll do, if you get a pension, it's going to be at a smaller level. It's going to be no cost of living adjustment. So there's various ways they will actually manage that. And effectively, I've argued for some time that the whole retirement industry, on which basically Australia's fund management industry is built on sand, and quicksand at that. Because the whole assumption is this process can go along. This process will end one day when governments look at each other and say, well, actually, this whole thing is a joke. It doesn't work. Because it isn't going to save anybody in government the cost of having to put up the money to pay for these in healthcare costs, their aged care costs or whatever. So let's just take a 12% off as a superannuation levy, just put them as taxes, because we're going to have to pay for it anyway. So the whole question of retirement becomes very, very different going forward. So you're going to have to work for much, much longer. And obviously, if those three things are hard now, they're going to get harder for your children. And one of the crucial things that people forget is, I gave a speech in, I think it was February this year, to some people in Melbourne. And there was a reporter there. She didn't introduce herself to me, and she wrote a fairly scathing piece saying, I didn't know what I was talking about. I don't know what I'm talking about. I always admit that. But the crucial thing she said was, I didn't understand there were $2 trillion in savings in Australia, and that was going to solve all our problems. Now, the amusing thing is, there are $2 trillion of superannuation savings, but on the other side of that is $4 trillion of debt. 1.7 trillion of that is personal debt, in terms of mortgages and everything else. And as you know, more and more people, when they get to retirement, actually get to retirement with debts. They don't actually pay off their mortgages. A lot of people have interest-only mortgages, where they're actually holding their principal stable until retirement. So that's going to have to be discharged. Then they're going to have to pay for their aged care, their health care, and provide an income for retirement. And you take that $2 trillion, it sounds like a lot of money, but you divide that by 22 million people. That's 100,000 roughly each. So pooling a couple together, that's 200,000. That's 4 years. So what happens after that? And obviously, if your parents or we use that up, what is the generational wealth transfer, which in our cases, the generation of baby boomers did achieve a wealth transfer from their parents? That's not going to happen. So if you actually look at all of those four dynamics that I'm talking about, then it's very, very difficult to see how the myth we've created that these four things will go on forever can continue. But the reality is nobody wants to talk about it. We just live in denial. We pretend that it's going to be there. But essentially, it's not going to be there. And the whole process of adjustment that needs to be done isn't being done. And we actually are now getting trapped in this process where we're pretending something which is happening all around us is not going to happen.